Thank you very much for having me here. So I'm really excited to be at a conference that promises to be a space for not just safe, but I think also brave conversations, knowing that in the process of having this chat, we might say things that we don't automatically always understand. We might hear things that we feel threatened by or confused by, but that is also the process of learning and having discussions. So I really appreciate the intentional way in which this space was set up today. So, of course, why tough times, right? We seem to be living in this moment of a political unraveling while ecological urgency remains as urgent as ever. Indeed, the disappointing outcomes in Belém in COP30, where on the one hand, the US didn't even show up, and on the other hand, we have news reports that fossil fuel lobbyists are embedded in many country delegations and are inside the room while indigenous people stand outside protesting, maybe encapsulates a lot of what we are here to discuss. And indeed, again, to come back to this question of emotions, I would like to suggest that right now we are living in a wounded world, a wounded and inflamed world where our wounds are also preventing us perhaps from having the clarity and the conversations we need to have in order to overcome the situation we are in. Most present, perhaps, in the minds of this sustainability-focused audience are the wounds of climate, wounds we are already beginning to experience with respect to extreme heat events here in Europe and floods, but also the fear of future wounds and our ability to be able to cope with them, an ability we know is also incredibly unequal across the world in relation to climate vulnerability and our ability to keep life going in the face of a changing climate. But then there are also the wounds that are to do with the economic activities that produce greenhouse gas emissions in the first place and maybe are also involved in getting rid of them. The extractive frontiers all over the world where people live next to polluting sites. And indeed, despite 70 years of environmental activism, local pollution remains a death-producing issue in many parts of the world. And as someone who was born and raised in a country that still lives with a lot of poverty, the fact that despite all of this, we still have enduring poverty in many parts of the world, or many people continue to lack the basic means for a dignified life, sanitation, clean drinking water. And of course, perhaps also on your minds, these potentially new sets of wounds, a sense of rising insecurity here in Europe and in the United States, a sense that lives for people's children will not be as good as their own lives, that we can't afford basic groceries, that what will I buy my child for Christmas this year? Concerns that seem to be front and center in people's minds. So, if we are all wounded, why are we not healing together? Why are solidarities shrinking rather than expanding? We instead see growing polarization, fragmentation, alienation, and I think this is the conundrum that we are here to talk about. Are we all in this together? So, indeed, drawing on the insights of environmental justice and decolonial scholars, I'd like to suggest that the word "we" itself is somewhat problematic, even though I realize I've used it many times already. So much of climate communication and global environmental governance seems to kind of point to this idea of a planetary we, assuming, sometimes implicitly, a shared human experience of living on the same planet and depending on it for our collective survival. And from there, we say, because we are all on the same planet and we should know, look, the problem affects all of us, that we must unite to save our own collective futures. And then with this narrative, when people resist, we usually blame, they don't understand the problem enough, they lack the education, they're not aware, they're short-sighted, they have been bought over by climate denialists. I think this diagnosis is wrong. And I think it's also ineffective. Because invoking a sense of kind of a shared human we, people should know better. First of all, it flattens environmental experiences, which are fundamentally stratified and stratifying, and it assumes shared trajectories. But our ecological trajectories are not shared. They are diverse, they are differentiated, and they are stratified. We are not equally culpable, and nor are we equally capable to act. This is something that Global South activists reminded us as far back as 1992 with the term common but differentiated responsibility. And while this concept is useful, it's increasingly too broad and two based on nation states and divisions between the North and the South to be politically and theoretically useful today, especially as my colleague at Sciences Po, Lucas Chancel, has shown, within country inequality in responsibility for climate emissions continues to grow. So how do we kind of update our theoretical and methodological toolkits to deal with the questions of inequality in the world that we are living in today? So today I want to kind of talk a bit about the question of inequality and argue that we need to pay more attention to the uneven, differentiated, and stratified environmental experiences that people have under global capitalism. And I want to argue that this failure to analyze the core dynamics of what I will call a colonial racial capitalism as a constitutive element of the global economic and environmental experience has resulted in flawed understandings of the problem and ineffective solutions. So my talk will make 3 points. First, that global capitalist ecology generates and depends on inequality. It's not incidental, it is rather functional to the system. This inequality is hidden and obscured through a range of organizational and ideological processes. This inequality produces fragmented realities. People live in fragmented realities, and then from there, their way of understanding the environmental problem is also different. Environmental subjectivities develop in these siloed realities. People understand and problematize environmental issues in different ways. This, in turn, produces a fragmented politics where, on the one hand, elite subjectivities dominate, marginalized or minoritized subjectivities are set to the side, and it becomes very hard for people to come together across diverse social and political boundaries. And I'll end by offering some suggestions from my own fieldwork on how I have seen these challenges been overcome in some contexts. So, with that in mind, I am a political ecologist and a kind of ethnographer and a sociologist, and so what does that mean? So this means I tend to pay attention to flows and relations. I tend to pay attention to how people relate to each other, how people relate to their natural environments, and to things that move, waste, money, value, etc. I also tend to pay a lot of attention to people's everyday experiences. So what do people do in order to sustain themselves, take care of their families? What do they buy, for what reason? How do they navigate changing environmental considerations? For example, how do they deal with the fact that water quality is poor in their communities, or they're being exposed to mosquitoes and catching malaria all the time? So I'm really interested in understanding everyday lived experience as a lens to understanding environmental politics. So to use kind of some political economic language, I pay attention to both work, so labor, the type of jobs people have, the type of jobs people do, and how those relate to the environment, but also care, reproductive work, the things that people consume, acquire in order to take care of themselves. So using this lens of both production and reproduction, I have researched environmental practices and movements in Indian cities. And particularly, I've asked this question, well, how do what people consume on a day-to-day basis, how does this shift when environment enters the picture? When do environmental concerns get people to shift their consumption practices, and why? And the second thing I pay attention to is when there is waste that is produced, what happens to it? Who deals with it? Who does the labor to sort it out? Where does it go? So with these two questions, I have noticed some interesting things in my fieldwork. So first and foremost, as this picture captures much better than I can tell you, I noticed that when I was observing people who were more well-off, so cultural and economic elites, the upper middle classes, and when they adopted green consumption practices, like, for example, riding a bicycle to go to work, they performed these practices in a manner where they sought to distinguish themselves from those who did this because they had to. So they said, I bike because I care. They bike because they must. And in doing so, they kind of set up these moral distinctions between their kind of, enlightened or informed environmentalism versus this more accidental green behavior. Now, another thing that came out in my work is I found that the people who actually perform ecological labor, cleaning streets, sorting recyclables, managing sanitation systems, tended to come predominantly from poor communities belonging to the Dalit or scheduled caste, so racialized minorities were often women. They performed these jobs often without stable work contracts or with temporary contractualized work arrangements. And what was also really interesting is, even though these were the people who actually did a lot of the work of cleaning, environmental narratives tended to blame them for the presence of waste. So they were the ones who were actually doing the cleaning, but nevertheless they were like, but you are the ones who are actually producing the waste because you're the ones who live next to it, you're the ones associated with it. And they were responsibilized for it, both being blamed and asked to do the work to clean it up at the same time. All while, again, being kept at the margins of environmental politics. So overall, it struck me as very interesting that these expressions of environmental concern and behavior were connected to very strong moral judgments and social class identifications. Now, this phenomena is not exclusive to India or Indian cities. And indeed, research in the United States and Canada and France has shown that environmental actions tend to carry strong symbolic meanings, which tend to divide people into different groups, and how people of those different groups feel about each other is often not very friendly. What Emily Haddad Kennedy calls a kind of affective polarization between people belonging to different environmental groups. And just like in India, often the dirty work of recycling or agricultural labor tends to be done by people who belong to poorer, low-income, migrant communities. But rather than attributing these class distinctions solely to the cultural dynamics of environmentalism, right? You can see if this is to do with cultural expression. I think it's more productive, along with other scholars of political economy, to think of them as connected to the broader inequalities that underpin global capitalism. These inequalities are salient to how work is structured and valued in globalized economies, to how markets are organized, and how they communicate cultural values and signal social worth, and how then people in turn appropriate and embody them in their everyday practices. So my broader theoretical argument here is capitalist economies reproduce inequality through work, through consumption, through crisis displacement, and that these inequalities shape environmental subjectivities in a way that make it very hard to have tough conversations. So this first point might be quite obvious to many of you. Political economy and world system scholars have long argued that capitalism systematically produces differentiated environments and populations. This fragmentation is not an accident of the system, but a precondition for accumulation. So when certain places, certain forms of labor are rendered cheap, flexible, and disposable, that helps cutting costs at important times. It helps avoid crises. It helps displace problems. Environmental sociologists have gone a bit further, as opposed to thinking of this as some sort of faceless monolith capitalism, instead to pay attention to the exact organizations, whether those are elite networks, undemocratic institutions, specific collections of political power that produce the type of both intentional actions and common sense practices that result in this form of displacement of various kinds of costs onto certain types of people and certain places. And indeed, inequality is not just produced out there in some nameless, faceless global structure. It is reproduced at the meso level, at the organizational level, and at the everyday level of life. And what I want to focus on is what are these everyday levels of reproduction in terms of how work, so whose work is valued, recognized, and protected, and the organization of consumption, so how markets organize aspiration, distinction, and belonging, and then from there, the organization of environmental action, which is how environmental issues are framed and acted upon. So let's first focus on the question of work. So what I witnessed in my fieldwork in India was no anomaly. The fact that there were these, cleaning workers sitting on the ground and sorting, and they were actually doing the ecological labor, but next to them somebody was saying, look, we have a recycling scheme. We are sorting things out. This is not an anomaly. And indeed, across the world, various forms of life-sustaining, socially reproductive work, cleaning work, the work of growing food, the work of taking care of children, tends to be disproportionately performed by marginalized and minoritized communities. Whether this is undocumented migrants growing food in the United States, whether this is Afro-Brazilians and indigenous people picking waste in the large garbage dumps outside Rio de Janeiro, whether this is Dalit manual scavengers, we see a very strong pattern where the people who do this labor are often cast as non-workers, non-citizens, or inherently suited to dirty or dangerous work, often because of either their gender, their race, their caste, or their migrant status. And what's also interesting is actually in the past 30 years, these conditions of work, where you perform a job but don't get paid a commensurate amount to it. You have to harm yourself to do the job, self-exploitation. These conditions are actually spreading. They've come to Europe with Uber, with flexibilization, with gig work. The devaluation of work has democratized. It is no longer something that is taking place only out there in the global south or in prison camps or in certain areas. The devaluation of work has democratized. And with this devaluation, you also see a simultaneous situation where in many parts of the world, public investment in services that might otherwise stabilize working class life are also reduced and denuded, particularly in liberal or market-based welfare states. These patterns are deeply historical. Scholars of feminist, post-colonial, and racial capitalism, from Maria Mies and W.E.B. Du Bois to Cedric Robinson and Gurminder Bhamra, show that capitalism from its beginnings has relied on gendered, colonial, and racialized forms of cheap labor to cut costs and increase profits. These relations continue to structure global supply chains, waste economies, and urban infrastructure today. Now, crucially, this devaluation of labor doesn't just stratify occupations, it stratifies people. It stratifies people in terms of the identities that they carry in the world, in terms of who is seen as respectable, deserving, and worthy of protection, which gets tightly tied to moralized hierarchies of race, caste, gender, and citizenship. And ultimately, this is also politically problematic because, as the American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois argued over 100 years ago, racism splintered the American working classes. It pit white and black workers against each other in a way that prevented them from building the type of class solidarity that is required to confront elite interests. Moreover, this devaluation of labor and work actually directly feeds into us buying more stuff. So I would like you to go to this next part of my argument here, about how devaluation of labor is also connected to how markets cultivate aspiration and belonging. So markets also, I forgot to go to this slide, but I'll give you a second to look at it. Yeah? On y va. All right. So my colleague Sophie Dubuisson-Kelly at Sciences Po has done a lot of work on this question about how do people consume? Why do people consume the way they do? Knowing that we know that this is not just, we didn't wake up one morning and say, I really want, you and I didn't imagine the iWatch in our brains. So how does it happen that this consumption economy is set up and produced? And what is the role of social inequality in producing consumption as the marker of a good life? So Sophie's work has shown that markets also generate and profit from social inequality through consumption by shaping what people aspire to and can access, and to generate enough demand to absorb the surplus of overproduction. So on the one hand, they cultivate a taste for exclusivity. So for example, here's this new Louis Vuitton mall on Champs-Élysées. You go in there, you feel special, everything smells good. You're like, oh my God, so it cultivates a taste for exclusivity. such as limited edition products, manufacturing scarcity, get in, running out of time, premium prices, controlling access, and organizing spaces and interactions that heighten consumers' awareness of their social position. You walk in there and you feel like you have moved up in the world. Or if you're up there in the world, you're strengthened in your position. At the same time, the availability of cheap products, knowing that they themselves are widely available because of cheap labor, see point above, and cheap nature, see the previous point, means that more people can come and participate in mass consumption, which is often framed as bargains or clever choices. Buy now, Black Friday, 50% off. Why don't you buy 4 sneakers instead of 2? And the idea that you can also come in and participate, even if you cannot go all the way up to that Louis Vuitton. Now, scholars from the South, like Rosana Pinheiro Machado and Veronica Gago, writing about lives under neoliberalism, have shown that participation in the market can be a vital way of establishing social belonging and citizenship for marginalized or poor communities, especially when work is devalued. When work is devalued, market participation becomes a way of obtaining respectability and social citizenship. Devaluation at work requires salvation by our consumption. So this creates an aspirational cycle. Status goods trickle down, new goods emerge at the top, and the treadmill keeps moving. And the cycle extends to ethical or green consumption, which are not immune to status dynamics, as I showed earlier. So whether it's eco-friendly goods or a sustainable organic market or a tote bag that says all sorts of things, these markers of distinction also produce the conditions where there is a dynamic of aspiration. And while the dynamic of aspiration, we might think that, oh, this will help bring more people in, what it also does is it stratifies. And far from uniting consumers around collective environmental goals, this dynamic perpetuates stratification and prevents green consumption from becoming a coherent domain of shared collective action. The final point I also want to make is, in this section, is inequality is also a pressure release valve for our economy. That is, the moment an ecological crisis becomes too tense in one spot, moving waste, outsourcing pollution becomes one way to dissipate the crisis from threatening the system itself. So ultimately, the point I want to make here is very simple. The demand for an idealized view of humanity must be reconciled with the real world, where the connections between people, especially across distances, have been established through this colonial, racial, capitalist political order, one that is fundamentally stratifying and stratified. So the actual threads that link us are not threads of solidarity. They are often threads of exploitation masked as exchange. But these metabolic vulnerabilities, interdependencies, and exploitations often remain invisible, both to those mobilizing for environmental causes and against them, because it is constantly moralized and misrecognized in everyday life. So inequalities are naturalized. What do I mean by this? Why do these threads remain invisible? Because many of these inequalities are obscured through ideological narratives that individualize and moralize the causes of poverty. Decades of research from sociologists show that the mechanisms that generate inequality, how labor markets value different kinds of work, how wealth accumulated through dispossession continues to structure opportunity, how welfare states were historically built on imperial resources, are rarely visible in everyday life. Instead, people make sense of these vast differences on the basis of individualized narratives of merit, what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls symbolic violence. And neoliberal ideologies, they reinforce this individualization, where the poor are blamed for their own precarity and asked to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they are not doing well, and people who are not green enough are asked to make better choices. I think these come from somewhat the same dynamic. And when racialized and colonial hierarchies recede from view, and we see racialized communities do well, they also get read within this narrative, where, as Michael Tesla and Darius Davis and other political scientists show, racial resentment intensifies precisely when previously excluded or racialized groups begin to rise socially. Their mobility is interpreted as not as the erosion of colonial advantage, but as the evidence that these groups are gaming the system. They're finding a way to jump up. Similarly, insecurity research shows that when dominant groups experience economic or symbolic loss, they become more receptive to narratives that cast immigrants, minorities, or outsiders as undeserving beneficiaries of a system that once reliably reproduced their own advantages. The inequalities produced by the workings of global capitalism have thus become moralized, individualized, and hidden, making the unequal exchange of global economic activity instead appear to be normalized trade relationships. Now, the important thing to say here, so inequality divides our material conditions. But we naturalize these inequalities. We think that, oh, there are strong ideological forces naturalizing inequalities. So what this means is that then people live and experience these inequalities in ways where they do not acknowledge their social origins, and obscure naturalized inequalities shape our environmental subjectivities. What do I mean by this? So feminist standpoint theory and broader traditions of situated epistemology assert that people do not observe their social and environmental conditions from any sort of neutral vantage point. We're not looking down like God, or what Donna Haraway would call the God trick. Stratifications shape our daily concerns, our sense of urgency, and even what we understand the environment to be. Do we understand the environment to be the planet? Do we understand the environment to be clean water? Do we understand the environment to be what we can afford to buy or not buy at the store? So our everyday embodied experiences within these hierarchically stratified social matrices influence our environmental subjectivities. This is exactly what ethnographic observation using the socio-material lens of political ecology reveals, which, no offense to my political science colleagues out there, the more classic socio-political approach of environmental politics tends to miss. Socio-material inequalities and political economic power fundamentally shape how environmental issues and policies are understood and problematized and responded to. Very quick example from my fieldwork in India, which I write about in my book. So in Indian cities, garbage is a big problem. There's garbage everywhere. People hate garbage. It gets in the way, causes diseases. It's a big mess. Now, the well-to-do in the city, the cultural elites, the people who work in the information and biotechnology industry, they see this problem as they blame two parties for this. The state. The government is inefficient, it's corrupt. The reason why there's garbage everywhere is because the government is inefficient and corrupt. Or they blame the workers. The workers are not doing their jobs properly, they slack off, etc. So from their perspective, the way to fix the system is to privatize it. Bring in private companies, make it more efficient, then the garbage will go away. Put a price on garbage that will incentivize these private companies to invest in waste management because they can make profits, commodify the system, marketize the system, make it more efficient. Waste workers see it very differently. What do waste workers see? They see all the waste that comes in from the city. They see that in the past 30 years, not only has the volume of waste gone up, but also there are more and more different types of materials in it. There are 25 different types of plastics. So what this means is to go through the waste and actually pull out the stuff that can be composted and recycled takes more time. So it's the sheer flow of materials that blocks the system, its diversity. It simply cannot be fixed by putting a price on it or making it more technologically efficient. So what I hope this example shows you is that these two groups have two very different ways of understanding the environmental problem by virtue of where they are located in relation to it, which is tied to their socioeconomic status and what they do for work. Now, these differentiated ways of seeing the environmental problem are not an issue in of itself. The problem is one set of understanding tends to dominate. The elite have more political, economic, and institutional and cultural power. Their ideas, their discourses, their narratives tend to dominate. The other ones recede from view. But in the moments when those marginalized and minoritized communities manage to enter this conversation and say, no, you do not understand this problem well. We know the waste differently from you do. We have a knowledge about the environmental cycles that you do not. And they assert their political power. They are able to shift the conversation away from elite misdiagnosis and problems that are improperly understood and solutions that do not work, and push for more transformative outcomes. And indeed, today at the global plastics treaty negotiations, even though in many ways there has not been a treaty yet, the fact that we haven't ended up with a bad compromise consensus treaty that would fundamentally entrench the status quo of plastics overproduction and entrench the political power of petrochemical and fossil fuel industries is thanks to the coalitions that have been formed between waste workers, between indigenous people, between scientists, and other standpoints that are historically minoritized or marginalized in environmental politics. And in my book, I won't go through all of this in the interest of time, I talk a lot about how it is in the process of people enacting community experimentation and political struggle while trying to solve environmental problems from a bottom-up basis that sometimes we have these spaces of transformative cross-class contact. Transformative cross-class contact, where social groups, through conversation, are able to shift their understanding of a problem away from something that is narrow to one that integrates multiple points of view, and through that produces the types of coalitions that can resist or counter existing dynamics of how environmental problems are produced and reproduced. And indeed, in these infrastructural contact zones where people come together through those weird alliances, we have some opportunities also to respond to the crisis of social reproduction, which, like the previous speaker said, what we all have in common is that we need to care for ourselves and we need to care for the people in our lives. So I want to end today with just quickly summarizing, and I won't go through, I will let you read the slide for a minute, before I go on to speculating briefly about Europe and the United States, because as you know, or as you may have been evident from my talk, I study the Global South, but I lived in the US for 14 years, and I now live in Europe. So I'm now going to do something that is not what I usually do, is I'm going to take the insights from my field, and I'm going to offer some suggestions to how we might think about these problems here in Europe and in the United States. So, now first of all, very important research has demonstrated that there's a very organized campaign pushing climate denial. There are PR companies, there are professionals whose whole job is to push the political narrative against environmental policies. I don't want to underestimate the importance of any of those sources, okay? So that's the first and foremost thing I want to say very clearly. And today, we see a moment, again, living and working in the US for a long time, we see a situation where political actors on the right and the far right are blaming migrants or environmental policies for those economic insecurity concerns, for those cost of living crises questions. But as a sociologist, the question I ask, what are the material conditions that make those ideas really interesting right now? What are the material conditions that make these ideas take off? Why is it that these ideas are speaking to people's anxieties or concerns? What are their anxieties and concerns, and where are they coming from? I hope I've given you some ways to think about that. So when right-wing leaders mobilize working-class support against environmental issues by portraying them as elite impositions that threaten what people feel they have rightfully earned, I think this narrative works partly because a lot of working-class and rural people do not feel themselves symbolically included within dominant environmentalisms. That is, the gulf between the cultural practices of the urban ecological classes and the rural working classes in particular seems very large. The symbols, the performances. From a sociological lens, we know these things matter, and this distance seems very hard to bridge, and it makes it more easy for these narratives to take out. Oh, those people don't care about you. They are doing this against you because they don't see you, they look down upon you, they other you. But this narrative is also politically useful for elite interests. By blaming environmental policies or migrants for cost of living crisis, it hides the role of economic elites and obscures how neoliberal development has concentrated power, hollowed out welfare systems, and deepened inequality within the US or Europe itself. Media ecosystems then amplify these fears, creating this generalized insecurity and translating that into opposition to green transitions and hostility towards migrants. The thing to remember here in Europe, just as in India, is lived embodied material inequalities shape how different groups experience environmental issues and ecological policy efforts. So the Yellow Vest protests, offered an early indication of this, where this fuel tax catalyzed broad opposition. But what we forget is that there was also general angst created, tied to a sense of a distributive unfairness. There were concerns about distributive unfairness behind this. And lots of data shows us that working class households often have more difficult embodied environmental experiences, whether that's due to lack of access to heating in the winter, poor or leaky homes, energy poverty, overstretched public services. Wealthier groups, by contrast, experience the environment as a set of positive choices. I can buy an electric vehicle. I can green my home. I can take a holiday by train as opposed to plane. So the set of positive choices versus constraints also shapes these narratives sincerely and in ways I think that really matter. But at the end, these European inequalities also do not stand alone. They are embedded in global hierarchies. The relative comfort of the European middle classes has long depended on extraction, outsourced pollution, and cheap labor elsewhere. And this narrative that the European working classes or the American working classes are being exploited and are paying more than their fair share only works if you forget those histories of imperial extraction. It is by downplaying those histories of imperial extraction also that a sense of working class resentment today can take off, which is a difficult truth to also, I think, a tough truth for us to confront. So I want to wrap up today by saying this final point. There is no neutral or universal we, but at the same time, we cannot give up on the we. The question is, how do we build a we? How do we forge climate and environmental coalitions that emerge from uneven material and social conditions, rather than presuming a shared experience of transition? This requires attending to the metabolic and infrastructural connections that link and stratify communities, and constructing a we rooted in concrete socio-material relations. I think key to this is also an epistemological shift, decentering our own perspectives as the professional managerial class of sustainability, and learning from frontline communities who have long borne the brunt of this eviscerating and wounding economy, and who have some insights onto how to confront it. Ultimately, rebuilding a we in this wounded world requires acknowledging history, seeing each other's pain, recognizing each other's pain as legitimate, even if sometimes our pain is linked by shared histories of exploitation or exploiting each other. And from that, understanding the shared conditions or the shared need or the shared prerogatives of social reproduction, which connects all of us, the search for a more safe, healthy way of living everyday life, and through that, building the kind of counterpower and coalition that can hold the elite interests that benefit from the current configuration or status quo to account, while also remaking the world as we live in it. So I'll stop there. Thanks. Yes,